pleasure to speak with you here. And in some ways, I feel really rather fraudulent in speaking to you because obviously all of you will have remarkable experience at working with nature. And I think that it's a theme that we are really working hard on in Yackandandah, but with a different focus. And that focus obviously is how do we draw our energy from nature rather than dragging it in a reasonably old technological way of burning stuff. So two things I'd like to acknowledge: the traditional owners of the land in which I'm speaking from, the Yathamatang, and several other groups in the surrounding area. And also I'd like to acknowledge one of my fellow Totally Renewable Yak committee members, Dennis, who I spotted on the screen before. So one of the reasons I feel a little bit fraudulent in speaking to you is that all we've managed to do in Yackandandah is exactly what it is that you are no doubt doing where you are right now, and that is working with the people around you to achieve some shared outcomes. And so what I'm proposing to do is to spend 10 or 15 minutes just talking through a range of stories, and I'm hoping that that will resonate well with the things that you're already doing in your day-to-day lives. Partly that's just about being in community, but it's also about working hard to improve things. And I think that we can all share in that aspiration. And the other part of that is that Totally Renewable Yackandandah hasn't set out to be a climate action group. What we've worked really hard at doing is focusing on two themes: one, of reinventing a local economy, and two, improving the quality of electricity supplies, especially as we note the transition away from coal as they get to end of life. So Yackandandah, we are a small town of about 1,000 people, but the footprint of Totally Renewable Yackandandah is in the realm of 2,400 people. And the picture on the screen there is of our launch in 2014. That's in April. And that gathering there followed a local council information forum about community energy and what the advantage of it was. And after about 2 to 3 months, we formed the goal of being 100% renewable by the year 2022. And then we've gone on from there, and without really any idea how we were going to achieve that 100% renewable target, but we've learnt a lot along the way, and we've had the good fortune of having a community that's very innovative and creative and ready to embrace new ideas. So it's made it a great deal easier. So the three key themes have really evolved for us as we start to understand both what's possible and what role we have in the possible. And one of the things that we've really observed about the value of local energy is the potential to improve energy resilience. And it's become really evident for us in association with the recent catastrophic summer we've had with fires, that where we're relying on electricity from distant places, how vulnerable we are to that electricity failing. And so we've been working quite hard with some of the communities in the Upper Murray who were badly fire affected, and certainly it was a couple of weeks before many of them had a power connection back, and certainly heading up into a month for a small number of people. And so we've observed where a small community starts to engage in a local energy supply, they become less dependent on the national energy market, which we feel like is a really strong feature, even to the point that many of the houses in Yackandandah that now have batteries are really thrilled that they will be able to operate their electricity fire pumps with their batteries and at least give themselves that little bit of extra redundancy in being able to respond to fire fronts. So this is Eve. He's the local fire captain, and the fire station in Yackandandah, volunteer fire station, now has a solar system and a battery and a smart energy controller, and we're just getting organised to add an automatic generator too. And the strong theme, obviously, we've been pushing for is that how important it is for an emergency service to have a resilient power supply, whereas previously they were entirely dependent on the grid, and they did have various generators that get pulled out of people's backyards when the power went out. And we're quite excited that piece of work has meant that the CFA in Victoria having a whole of CFA renewable energy program, and they're using some of the learning from Yackandandah to be able to advance that. A second theme that we have is the prospect of local economy, and I don't think you need to look very far to think about what that might mean. Clearly, if you stop spending so much money on electricity, then you can spend it on other things. It's not a complicated equation. And the image there on the screen is of the Yackandandah Health Service. It's a little retirement home coupled with some allied health of physio and also a little childcare centre. And early on in our activities, we approached the board of the health service, and over a period of time of swapping ideas and sharing knowledge about what could be possible with renewables and savings they might make, they installed 99 kilowatts of solar and have gone on now to save themselves $35,000 in the first year of operation. And they are paying that off in 3.5 years. And the other feature, which I think is a really strong theme for anyone who's living in a regional or rural community, is that saving that they've made in their power bill has been able to keep the local GP service operating, because within a couple of weeks of that system going on, the solar system, the GP was closing. And as a result, the health service was able to secure their own GP and continue the medical practice going. And to me, what a really powerful demonstrator of what happens when you stop spending so much money on electricity. And then a third feature, and no doubt of interest to this forum, is not something that we have operated as a really key feature of our activity, but certainly important to the committee members, and also certainly in tune with the science and lived experience probably of most of us, is how quickly climate change is advancing. And just as a little story there, the battery in the red cabinet there is located at a little wildlife shelter, and wildlife shelters around Australia are experiencing a doubling of their care needs every 10 years. And that's associated with the increasing impact on animals, wildlife in general, of climate change and, of course, advancing development and loss of natural habitat. So that local wildlife shelter was always operating on a generator, and they have since then, with the assistance of Tri, installed I forget the number, but I think a 25 kilowatt hour battery and a solar system. And in the first 12 months of operation, saved themselves $9,000 on diesel, and also the added noise and physicality of filling up a generator all of the time, and obviously reduced the noise for the wildlife they are caring for. The other thing we helped them do is install a commercial solar hot water system to replace their wood burner, which they used to burn summer and winter to heat hot water. They also used to have an instantaneous gas hot water, and they were using a 45 kilogram tank of gas every 6 weeks, and they're now using one once a year, so one gas bottle each year to make their hot water. Point being is that it's so important for us to rapidly change our energy supply to address this climate change question. So one of the growing observations we make is how remarkable the experience is for individuals across Yackandandah, and I think you could say this about people across Australia. And this gentleman here, Mark, is a participant in Yackandandah's third microgrid, and he's standing in front of his 14 kilowatt hour battery and battery inverter. And he was particularly thrilled, and I referenced him vaguely before, about his capability of being able to run his electric fire pump using his battery. And he's living right up in amongst the bush in an open paddock. But all of a sudden, the financial value of the battery and the energy system became less important. And his critical thing was, how do I make sure that I've got as much energy as possible during the fires that came quite close to Yackandandah? So the thought is people are starting to realise the broadened value of renewable energies beyond just saving cash. So one of the things that we did in Yak is early on in the piece, we approached the network operator, which is AusNet Services, and one of their subsidiaries, which has now become known as Mondo. And we came up with a 5-stage transition plan, and it's captured there. And I'm really happy to come back to it, but I'm going to skip over it. But essentially it was stage 2 was the widespread, and you'll know it as a bulk buy, but a shared customer purchasing program right across the town with the addition of a smart energy controller. So we offered that in stage 2. Stage 3 was the addition of batteries when they became viable for people, and that process continues. Stage 4 is the addition of a common retailer, and we now have a unlisted public company called Indigo Power, which is a social enterprise, and written into its constitution is the plan to return 50% of profits back to the community. So that retailer is now in place and trading local electricity with a tariff. And stage 5, we're just in the finalising steps of adding a community-owned battery, which will be charged behind the meter with a rooftop solar system, so that that electricity will be sold back to local community members through the evening when the sun goes down. So I've quite quickly just stepped through each of those things, responding to the request to be on time. But one of the features that has been really important to our evolution is making sure very early on that we visited people that we knew to be important to our success. And they were the health service, which I've already mentioned, AusNet Services, which I've discussed, and we worked up that 5-stage roadmap. And another was the water utility, which operate as an independent organisation from council. And this is Yackandandah's potable water treatment plant, and they've installed 43 kilowatts of solar and an equivalent amount of battery. And that system treats the raw water into drinking water into Yackandandah. So that's probably about as much as I wanted to say, but this image for me really captures something that's been important for us, and that is that we have spent a lot of time, especially in the first 2 years, of talking and creating possibilities and encouraging people and working with those people that we already knew were inclined to act, to give them extra reasons to get on and be active. And we have relied very heavily on private investment, and particularly private investment on people's own property. And there's a whole range of advantages of that, one of which obviously is that people then own the asset and it's their responsibility and their insurance and so forth. The gentleman speaking in the head of the image there, Søren Hermansen, is from a little island in Denmark, and his community transitioned to 100% renewable in the year 2007, his whole island. And so I think the really key message for us, from us, is that the prospect of 100% renewable is absolutely within fingertips reach, and all it does is require some concentrated effort and doing the things that you folk already do beautifully, and that's being resourceful and using the relationships you no doubt have around you, and being strategic about those relationships to work toward the goal. And whether that's renewables or regenerative agriculture, I don't know what is in front of you, but I'm going to finish off there, and thank you very much for the privilege to speak to you all.
Matt, thank you so much for joining us. I found that just absolutely fantastic. I really appreciated it. You don't get off the hook that easily. You did so well with keeping to time. I've got 2 quick questions for you. So the first comes from Andy Bray, and Andy's asked whether, when you say that these groups saved X amount per year, were these systems donated, or how are you reaching that figure?
So obviously each group is unique. If we're talking about the health service, they indeed had money set aside for the purpose of paying their energy bills, and they were able to then dedicate that money to elsewhere. The money that funded the health service solar install was bequeathed to them, and they were in the fortunate position of having that capital. But nonetheless, the payback period was 3.5 years. So even if they didn't, they weren't able to be receiving that money as a donation, it was certainly a viable thing for them to borrow that money.
Fantastic, thank you. And we've got another question here from Karen Stark, who's up at Narromine in New South Wales. And Karen's question is the minigrid vision a virtual power plant, or is it a type of peer-to-peer trading? How is that going to play out?
So lots of little idiosyncrasies in language in there. We have 3 microgrids, and the definition of those microgrids is users cooperating in a single line and all bound by the same transformer. Each of the main participants has a solar system and a smart energy controller to be able to orchestrate movement of electricity among properties. Our vision is that we will have a series of interconnected microgrids across town, forming a mini-grid, and to use the definitions offered in the question, it's very much a VPP rather than a blockchain solution of any kind.
Yep, fantastic. Thank you. And thanks for a great question, Karen. I learned a lot just from Matt's response. Last one before we go to our next speaker comes from Martin Bushby. And to be honest, Martin, I don't even know what you're talking about. So I'm really looking forward to Matt answering this one. Have you looked at the 1414 degrees silicon power storage battery systems for large scale power storage?
Yeah, look, I'm deeply fascinated, and to answer the question, what is it? The real innovation that's in front of us is how do we store electricity so that we can shift it from the times it's easy to generate to the times we want to use it. And the 1414 battery is I think that's the temperature at which silicon becomes molten, and the intention is to use the molten silicon as the means of storing energy, and then in various ways that's fed back through the system to drive steam turbines and provide energy back at the time that it's needed. It's a beautiful solution. One of the challenges with any large infrastructure development like that is that by and large they're out of scope of a group of passionate locals, and if someone wants to come and put a 1414 battery here, we'd love it, but it's outside our skill set and our budget.
Okay, I'm going to quickly squeeze in one more question from Deborah. Could you tell us the number of members on the three? You've got micrograms there, Deborah. Are you talking about microgrids? I'm going to go with microgrids, Matt.
So the three microgrids range. There's two of them have 14 households, and the third has 9 households. And the specific questions we were resolving in each one were different. In the first one, which we built in 2017, that was very much just testing the microgrid hardware, the microgrid controller. The second and third ones were resolving the question, how do we use existing electricity network infrastructure to meet the modern demands we place on it? And specifically, it was testing single wire earth return parts of the network, which is centrally right across Australia, and their extension cords draped across the paddocks, really. And the requirement to draw lots of electricity for short periods of time, and also the requirement to feed in lots of electricity that we generate from solar is causing real troubles for swirl lines. And the purpose of the microgrid trials was, how do we use smart renewable energy technologies to use the existing network assets so that they actually support our ambitions, all of our ambitions around renewables, rather than just spending a lot of money upgrading them.
Fantastic. I think I could listen to you talk for hours, but unfortunately tonight we don't have them. So thanks again, Matt. We greatly appreciate it. It's now my absolute pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Carolyn Hendriks is an associate professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Carolyn is a social researcher and an educator of diverse modes of citizen and community participation, which I think is what gets me really excited about her work. So a lot of Carolyn's work really looks at the democratic functionings and citizen-led initiatives to solve collective problems. And so while Carolyn has obviously worked a little bit in the Indi region, I find learning from the different experiences that Carolyn has and the different communities that she's worked with is a really nice complement to unpacking the specifics of TRI. So Carolyn, I can see that you've now got your screen up. I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you again for making yourself available.
Yeah, thanks, Verity, and thanks to Matt as well for sharing his story. Hi, everyone. I'm visiting here from Canberra, but I originally come from Wagga. And I've been listening to the community resilient forums that Farmers for Climate Action have been running over the past couple of weeks, and learning a lot about the different kind of views that are coming forward from different farmers around Australia. So as Verity mentioned, I'm a social science researcher and educator, and I work on public engagement in contemporary public policy. A lot of my work in the past has been on sort of structured ways of bringing citizens into public policy, but my latest research is really looking at a lot of grassroots efforts to govern, essentially, to get in there and try and solve collective problems themselves. And that's why I've been researching organisations like TRI to really try and understand what can we learn from these organisations, particularly in the space of climate change, and what else can we take from these organisations as communities really try and grapple with how to push reforms on climate change, especially as they're facing its material effects and want urgent action. So I guess the sort of starting point for what I wanted to talk about tonight was really recognising this governance void that we're operating in climate change, which is this combination of a deeply complex policy issue that's very divisive, and we're also facing rising public distrust in our public institutions. And this combination of losing legitimacy in the very institutions we need for reform at a time when we need reform makes for a double kind of challenge, I think. And in this governance void, I think what's very interesting is a whole range of innovative forms of social action that are emerging. And TRI is just one example of this kind of activity. more common and more popular, certainly in the major media, is, I guess, a range of social action, which is sort of comes under the kind of work of resistance, protest, mobilisation, and even alliances like the one that Farmers for Climate Action have created, trying to build groups together across for a common cause. But I guess what you see on the screen there is pictures of Extinction Rebellion, the school strikes, and a group many of you probably know about, which is called the Knitting Nanas. Now, these are all forms of protest, but they are pushing the boundaries of what we usually think of in social science of these social movements. They're kids getting involved rather than sort of the classic greenie images. There's a whole range of people involved in Extinction Rebellion and international movement for climate change. And groups like Knitting Nanas, which I've been researching in the context of coal seam gas politics in northern New South Wales, yes, they are protesting and they have a particular position, but they are really trying to have disarming conversations, not confrontational conversations in their community. And they're really playful and full of humour. So these are new and old forms of social action. But I guess what's happening here is the public is really expressing a desire for governments and business to do something. So in contrast, I guess you've got a whole range of other kinds of social action around climate change that is emerging, where citizens are kind of fed up with the lack of action and are just getting on and doing and making change through practical interventions. And I think what's really fascinating about TRI, but there's over 100 other community energy projects around Australia and thousands around the world, is that often they're forming relationships that bypass government. So they're forming connections and solving problems by working with the market, or sometimes working with other civil society organisations. So this is sort of a real nimble way of getting on and solving problems. It's innovative. It's involved in trying to bring people together rather than being divisive. And I've been working on a whole range of, I guess, what I'm calling doing publics that engage in this kind of activity in a whole range of area of public policy, including criminal justice, substance abuse. There's a lot going on also in social welfare around homelessness, food distribution, food production. So these are all areas where there's groups and collectives of citizens that are just trying to solve some of the problems that our governments and our markets are failing or have never managed to adequately address. So in this work, I guess there's a lot going on in climate change beyond the kinds of community energy groups that TRI has talked about. And I guess what you see on the screen there is a whole range of groups that emerge often spontaneously in the context of crises. And we've seen a lot of these in the context of the bushfires, but also in COVID, as communities rally together to try and support. In the first picture there, the community defenders, this was a group of citizens that actively self-organised to support the formal civil society groups, the fireys themselves. So you had a group of community residents, if you like, trying to support another community organisation that was stretched. And this was a really productive, constructive relationship. But obviously you can imagine all the risks that come with everyday community members trying to step into spaces where they're not trained to assist. And the other image you see there was a group that emerged actually through Canberra called Slabs for Hero, which initially emerged from a group of people who wanted to provide some beer for the fireys, but it extended well beyond then donations of beer to food and water. And of course in COVID, there's been lots and lots of evidence of these kinds of what they call mutual aid groups. There's other ways in which citizens are self-organising. Here's an example of one where a group of professionals who provide counselling services got together to form an organisation called Psychology for Safe Climate. And they have put together a whole range of resources for people dealing with the material effects of climate change and also the trauma of crises like bushfires. So have a look at them on the web. But my point here, I guess, is that there are different ways that individuals and collectives are contributing to these conversations around climate change. And it may be in very practical ways by innovating in community energy, or it may be in coalescing around some professional skills that people have. The third example I want to give you is a group, is really about how citizens are self-organising to create conversations around community resilience in the context of climate change. So here's a group called Make a Change Australia, which is a non-for-profit that ran a large project in central Victoria over the last couple of years called Ramp Up Resilience. So this is a community initiative. It did have some funding from local government and the Victorian government, but essentially what they were trying to do there was hold a series of conversations around a theme that can be very divisive in local, particularly rural communities. So have a look at that website. I really encourage you to see some of the work that they've done. But these are initiatives that are coming from communities because they're trying to push the conversations forward. So I guess one of the points I wanted to make tonight was to really talk about the effects of these kinds of initiatives well beyond that local level. And I guess you can see in the Indi region where Tri is located, there's a lot of projects that have been about enabling citizen agency and citizens to try and step in and have some control over what's going on in their communities. And this can be quite infectious. I think there's a lot going on in that northeastern Victoria that has been seeded over years and years of community leadership programs, etc. And I think one of the other things that's going on in this space is really the capacity of communities to show and demonstrate innovative solutions. So they're not just asking governments to make reforms, they're actually demonstrating that these solutions are possible. And in doing that, they're actually working across sectors, across borders, across all the things that our governments often say are very difficult to do. The final point is something that I've observed directly, which is the way in which these groups play a really powerful role in advocacy. And this isn't the classic advocacy where you get sort of groups lobbying and trying to push an agenda. It's a kind of advocacy through demonstrating projects. So I was lucky to sit in on a public hearing before COVID landed on us down in Victoria. The Legislative Assembly there is running an inquiry on how communities in Victoria are tackling climate change and how the government there can assist. And they've been running a whole series of public hearings, and they managed to make a visit up to Yackandandah and visited the work of Tri. And the following week, I went to the public hearing that was held in Melbourne. And it was really interesting. The MPs on that committee were using Tri as an example in their scrutiny of the federal agency, EMO, the Australian Energy Market Operators, to really ask them questions about how the market's operating, why do they manage it in a certain way. So Tri is really becoming a kind of an example of demonstrating how the system could, our energy system and its regulatory context, how it could be reformed. So these are organisations like Tri are doing quite a lot of work indirectly, if you like, well beyond their local area in actually trying to change the way our whole energy system is being pushed forward. So I guess just to sort of wrap it up together there, I'm not saying that these doing publics are the answer to everything on climate change. We're obviously going to need lots of different types of publics to come together to push reform. But I do think these local initiatives, particularly the work of Tri, are really pushing along a lot of change in climate change, and I really encourage communities out there to give it a go. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Carolyn. That was the second time I've seen you give that presentation. I still found it absolutely fascinating. So thank you. We've just got a couple of questions that have cropped up. Andy, you're on fire tonight. So Andy's put a question in. Do you have any observations about how active communities or perhaps doing publics could interact with large-scale renewables projects to maximise local outcomes?
So, I mean, I guess there's lots of different examples around Australia and wind and renewables. I mean, I'm sort of more familiar with what's going on in the ACT, and I think there's quite a lot of community groups that are working closely, for example, with our local/state government here I don't know off the top of my head of large-scale projects. I think there is some in Indigenous communities, and there's a group at ANU that is working in Indigenous community in the context of a large resource project. So I think there's from my understanding, there's all manner of community energy projects out there. I think the scaling up thing is a challenging one because I guess it depends on whether or not the community is still owning the initiative, and that there's some trade-offs there between having it local, having the governance in the community, and scaling it up.
Thanks, Carolyn. I've just got a question as well. And I think one of the things that comes to mind to me is when you talk about these communities, and Matt talks about his communities, are there common characteristics that underpin the way in which these individuals are able to come together to really start making a change and to move past the politics and everything else that has held us back? Are there common characteristics that we as an organisation or the broader community that's interested in this space should be investing in fostering through regional communities in particular?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there is a kind of community leadership element that goes into these projects, whether they're in community energy or in other areas that I mentioned. I mean, it does require a group, often of frustrated citizens, to say, look, we just want to get this issue solved. So I guess it's a kind of collective capacity, and these are citizens that aren't kind of highly marginalised. Often they're citizens that are working sometimes for the marginalised, but they've got access often to resources and to materials and knowledge, and that often is embedded in community leadership. But Dennis and Matthew can probably might say something more about the specific skills in Indi. I do think that the broader community and political culture in these communities and people's sense of possibility, and whether they've got an active MP that's listening and able to facilitate connections, I think that does help as well.
That sense of possibility is a really great way of framing it. How do you create that sense of possibility? Matt, Dennis, did you want to take yourself off mute as well and add to that one?
Yeah, I'd really like to it, Verity. And I think that Carolyn touched on it really neatly, and I used a word of creativity. But I think that what we really need is a sense of imagination, and it really lacks imagination to continue to bed yourself down in a technology that worked well 50 years ago, but now no longer serves purpose. So I would suggest the sense of imagination is critical in this, and regardless of whether it's renewables or transitioning agriculture or anything else. And there's amazing examples of imagination, and in answer to the question around scaled developments, it's really difficult for small communities to engage in that. No doubt Charlie Prell's got a view on that. I mean, in Victoria, there is a real poster child of community energy, where Hepburn, a group of people in Hepburn, built 2 wind turbines and had great results, and those turbines continue to power the equivalent of 2,000 homes. But equally, and I noticed that there's representatives in the forum from Innova, who is Australia's first community-owned retailer, are really starting to own some real expertise and grunt in being able to leverage the things that communities do well into doing larger scales of activity. And I think it's a really exciting transition. But I'll hand over to Dennis there, Verity.
I guess what I could add is that when a federal MP is supportive of and listens to a community and it's obvious that they're going to be supportive of what the community's endeavours are going to be, then that, I think, actually accelerates the sense of possibility and a sense of people know that they'll be supported in running an unusual or innovative idea. So I think there's a really strong relationship between the emergence of groups that have a crack at things, that it's not acceptable just to shoot people down, knock down the idea because it's too crazy or, innovative, but to rather embrace the possibilities. And I think leadership is really important in actually capturing that.
Well said, Dennis. Thank you for jumping in with no warning to provide comment on that as well. Much appreciated. And Dennis, we have another question to Matt and to Carolyn. And Carolyn, I was thinking of your work that you've done up around some of the CSG fields, which might be relevant to this one as well. From Ingo, how are we going to resist the massive push from the gas industry entering rural communities to commence their destructive practices? Do you want to comment quickly on that one?
Yeah, I mean, you can look around Australia. I mean, there are, apart from Queensland, and I think they were sort of the zone where the coal seam gas really started to emerge. But you can see in Victoria and New South Wales, it's been the communities that have expressed their concerns about coal seam gas. And even now, the coal seam gas decision on the project I was looking at, it remains uncertain. It may end up being the share market that determines this. But communities have given it a really good crack. And I think this whole COVID, I mean, it's raising lots of interesting issues for us all, but food security is a big issue. And I think, our governments are going to have to think hard about how much gas we need to pump out for the rest of the world, when we may want to be thinking more about land and water and our own resources and protecting those.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Carolyn. Okay, beautiful. Alison from Innova, did you want to comment? I can't see you on my screen. Where are you? If you want to take yourself off mute, Alison. Oh. No. Alison, I've got a message saying you'd like to speak, but I can't find you on my screen. Hold on.
You're there, Alison, but I think you're on mute.
I should be off now. Is that right?
Yes, you are. There you go.
And thanks, Matthew, for mentioning us. Yes, well, we've now been going we started doing all the research and bringing the community together back in 2014. And we did the applications and got our retail license as a community-owned social enterprise in 2015 to form, as Matthew said, Australia's first community-owned renewable energy retailer. So we've now been going in terms of operating and taking on customers since mid-2016. And we operate right through New South Wales now, and we'll be moving into Queensland early next year. But I think what I would say about us is that we're here to work with communities that want to do projects. We exist to help communities become self-sustaining. And our whole purpose is focused on working to partner with community groups that want to move into the area. We haven't been able to work with Matthew's group because we're not in Victoria. Victoria is the only place where our license doesn't run. But we can operate with any other group that's wanting to do generation across the rest of certainly in New South Wales at the moment. And our licence covers the whole of the national electricity market. So it's really been about, in terms of forming ourselves, we are actually made up of 1,600 investors, 1,600 community scale investors. We raised 4 million, 70% of that from the Northern Rivers, and the other 30% from every other state and territory in Australia, just from small investors, people who would put in $1,000 to build, to get our licence and to get off the ground. And since then, we've taken on another roughly 400 investors. So we have 1,600 investors at the moment. And we now have some 8,000 customers in New South Wales, but we are there primarily to, as we see it, to facilitate self-sustaining communities. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that, either about how we formed, what it took to do the forming, or how we could work with other groups. We've got our first pilot microgrid going in the Byron Arts and Industry Estate. We're shortly going to launch our first virtual power plant, and we've just obtained funding from the New South Wales government to put in a major community scale battery.
What an extraordinary achievement. And I'll just acknowledge, I think Felicity is still on the line as well, Alison. Felicity's still here.
She's our
so if,
yes. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Felicity. So just quickly, if anyone would like to follow up, I'm just very conscious we've got 9 minutes left to go in the webinar, but if anyone would like to follow up with Innova, please just let FCA know and we can put you in the right direction, or you can go straight to Innova's website. They've got a great website. So I'm sure Alison and Felicity would love to hear from you. And thanks to both of you for making yourselves available to share a small amount of the Innova story tonight. We might have to do a separate webinar with you guys.
Are from New South Wales, or how many are from Victoria in your group? So at the moment, so yeah, open to hearing any approaches.
There's a good mix. Beautiful. And now I'm just going to quickly throw Andy Bray. You have been putting a few comments in. I'm going to give you 30 seconds if you'd like to just quickly comment on the community energy development component and your experience from the wind industry, and any key messages that should be shared with this group as they go about thinking of community energy and doing publics in their own region. You're up, Andy. And now I've got to find you to unmute. Right.
Yes, I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh well, thanks for the call up. I guess I'd say just the question I was asking of Carolyn before was, had she sort of looked at the way that the local communities interact with large-scale wind and solar projects, because that's the kind of work we've done with the Australian Wind Alliance for a number of years. And I do understand the sort of spectrum, I guess, between, you know, community control on one end and working with large-scale projects which are, you know, typically commercially controlled, and the Hepburn Wind, which brought those together. You know, even a 2-turbine project is incredibly complicated and, you know, massive thing to undertake, not just at a community level, but obviously at the technical and economic and, you know, etc. level. And I think it's a marvellous project and extraordinary testament to the people who got it together and still keep it going. But with one of the things that we're working on is is to try and maximise the local outcomes from large-scale wind and solar projects. So bringing together, you know, the community funds that many of them have to work together with other parts of the community to you know, to get really good sort of social outcomes that you might not be able to get if they weren't there. And particularly when it comes to renewable energy zones, which are now starting to pop up, you've got a real opportunity where there's potentially, you know, 12 or 24 sort of solar, wind, battery projects all sort of landing in one geographical area. With that kind of a build out, we really need to be thinking, and this can be driven from the community, what does the community want out of these projects? And it could be a whole lot of the things that they've done at Yackandandah, like microgrids and you know, things of that nature. But but there's a lot of creative thinking can be done around it, I think.
I think that's the theme for tonight, isn't it? The creative thinking. Beautiful. Thanks for doing that one really quickly, Andy, and apologies for throwing to you with no notice.
Right.
That's it from our speakers for tonight. Thank you again to our speakers, but before you drop off the line, everyone, you haven't joined here just to listen to a talk fest. So before you dock off, there's a couple of things that I'd like to draw your attention to. The first, Karen Stark has flagged in the chat, and you should have an email in your inbox from me already, outlining the pathway to be involved in the community energy co-design process that Helen Haynes is currently leading at the moment. There is a link to the website. I know the public dialogue at the moment is around the gas industry. There's a really unique opportunity to work with an independent and to actually get your voice heard on what community energy could look like in your region. So please follow that link, explore what that could mean for you. The second point that I want to raise for everyone is that Farmers for Climate Action will be releasing a report in the next 2 weeks. Our Regional Horizons report is our response to ensure that farmers and regional communities have a very clear voice on the importance of a climate smart recovery to our COVID-19 pandemic scenario. There's a few key objectives in that report which we would love to feature some additional farmers' voices and rural Australians' voices more broadly on. So the first is around a national climate change and agriculture plan and program to be able to support the research and development we need. The second is around, sorry, my dogs have decided to bark now. The second is around the development of a land and environment investment fund to support solutions in the land sector. The third is around regional resilience, and we've heard that word so many times tonight. So if regional resilience is something that is really important to you, you're passionate about learning networks, you want to get involved, please drop me an email, let me know. I'd love to be able to showcase your story. And the fourth goes to the heart of what we've been talking about here tonight, and that's about actually creating a regional energy transition program to be able to facilitate communities really taking advantage of things. So everything is not quite as challenging as the fascinating journey that Matt and Dennis, etc., have had to go through, so that communities are supported and empowered to go through that energy transition program, whether they're a community that is currently dependent on the fossil fuel industry, or whether they're a community that can simply reap huge benefits by diversifying their energy sources locally. If any of those sound like they are up your alley, you have an email in your inbox right now. I would love to hear from you over the next week. I do apologise for the absolutely terrible energy puns that are scattered throughout the email. Been a long day, cannot help myself, so you have to bear with me. And that's it from me. Thank you once again to all of you. I'll stay on the line for another 10 to 15 minutes if anyone wants to follow up. My email address is always there. I'll put it in the chat now. And thank you for taking time out on your Thursday. And thank you again to our absolutely wonderful speakers for joining us this evening.